The Russian Navy, a force of nearly 100 ships and submarines, which, despite the breakup of the Soviet Union, is still considered to be among the most formidable on the globe.
The Russian Navy of today is dominated by its submarine force.
Boasting over 3 centuries of naval tradition, it was the vision of a single man, Russian Tsar Peter the Great.
He was brilliant in mathematics, geometry, and shipbuilding.
He not only created an organized fleet, but also designed and engineered ships.
Produced in a virtually landlocked nation with almost no seagoing experience, it rose rapidly, becoming a world-class ocean-going blue water navy in less than a single generation. Over 250 years later, during its peak in the mid-1980s, legendary Soviet Admiral Sergei Gorshkov molded it into a force of over 3,000 vessels.
He played a tremendous role in the creation of the atomic fleet.
This fleet faced off with the U.S. Navy for nearly half a century during the hair-triggered years of the Cold War, a time when nuclear annihilation could be unleashed at any moment. Today, the Russian Navy struggles against different adversaries, stringent budgets and scarce resources.
The condition of the Russian naval fleet today is tragic.
Yet it still retains tremendous power and pride, with enough advanced ships and weaponry to strike any navy or nation on Earth that dares to attack it. Celebrated since 1714, Russia's Navy Day expresses the deep national pride of the Russian people in an extraordinary maritime heritage that stretches back over 300 years. From landlocked Moscow, with its ancient onion-domed cathedrals and walled fortresses, to the magnificent port city of St. Petersburg, with its resplendent palaces, squares, bridges, and legendary naval institutions, the people of Russia have for centuries sought their destiny on the seas. Testimony to their calling is evoked in the many maritime monuments and memorials which dot the landscape. Standing sentinel on a hill overlooking the far northern city of Murmansk is a towering monument to the Russian soldier. And nearby in the city of Severomorsk, historic home base of the Northern Fleet, is a great statue of a Russian sailor. Both are called Alyosha. They symbolize Russia's common soldier and sailor. To the people of Severomorsk, Alyosha is the soul of Navy Day.
This holiday was lost for a while, but in 1939 Stalin ordered to revive it and celebrate it on the last Sunday of July. From 1939 up to this day, we celebrate this holiday on that day.
The heart of Russia's Navy Day is embodied in a fleet of modern vessels that includes some of the world's most powerful submarines.
The Russian Navy now is mostly a submarine fleet. There's also a surface part. The surface part includes an impressive nuclear-powered cruiser called Peter Veliki and a carrier called Kuznetsov. And then there were smaller ships, and then there were some coastal craft.
But due to the political upheavals of the early 1990s, which led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and chronic budgetary shortfalls, a large part of the Russian fleet can no longer be kept operational.
The Soviet fleet, which is now the Russian fleet, was the second largest fleet in the world after the United States.
Now it has less than 100 ships, and of those 100 ships, maybe 10% can go to sea at any one time.
Yet even at this comparatively modest operational force level, the Russian Navy still stands among the top 5 navies in the world, behind the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and India. But as the Soviet Navy, during the nearly 50 years of the Cold War, it was substantially stronger, challenging the United States for control of the world's oceans. The traditions of the Russian Navy are even older than those of the U.S. Navy, and it owes its creation to the power and vision of a single man. That man is Peter the Great, Tsar of all Russia.
Peter the Great understood that Russia's development was impossible without trade with Europe, and Russia needed commerce, cultural and scientific exchange, etc. Thus, Peter decided to initiate communication with Europe through sea trade.
St. Petersburg is the site of Russia's first naval academy.
The first academic institution of the Navy fleet was named the Division of Peter the Great. Today, there are many Navy colleges, especially in St. Petersburg, including Navy engineering colleges for nuclear submarines, colleges for engineering surface vessels, and colleges that train submarine officers.
These academies operate in many ways that differ from naval academies in other nations, such as Britain, Japan, and the U.S.
Basic education in the United States is conducted in regular civilian institutions, and only after graduation from those civilian high schools one is able to receive his or her naval officer's education. In contrast, our Navy education begins from the moment of our entrance into a Navy high school, where one obtains his or her primary education, and afterward receives a Navy college education. After graduation, one enters institutions on a higher level of the Naval Academy and the Academy of the General Headquarters. Thus, we possess a multi-step system of Navy education.
Despite the training received at these naval academies, low levels of pay for graduating naval cadets mean that today's Russian Navy faces serious challenges.
Some students want to enter the college in order not to serve, to live 5 years at state's expense, receive higher education, and then leave for civilian work.
Thus a law was issued, stating that whoever studies in the Navy school is obliged to sign a contract, according to which graduates can resign only after 5 years of service.
No matter what their plans after graduation, for the cadets, the ceremony itself is a time of tremendous celebration, steeped in tradition.
It is generally a very special day, during which every graduating student receives a new qualification, a dagger, and the rank of officer. One of the most important moments during the ceremony is when graduates say farewell to the banner of their divisions. The banner is carried out in front of the formation, and all of the graduates take off their peak caps and kneel before the banner. This is a very emotional and I would even say sensitive moment for every officer. Such a moment is remembered forever.
One of the Admiral Pavel Nakhimov Academy's traditions is particularly unique.
Nakhimov, like Peter the Great and other figures of the Tsarist times, became symbols. And the Nakhimov Academy in St. Petersburg, the high school naval academy, is one of those places that commemorates this man. The statue of him there with the nose being rubbed for good luck, a symbol that they could turn to, a symbol that remains potent and powerful today.
Yet as important as naval training was and is, creating a full-fledged Navy requires more than training men. It also requires building traditions, and that means achieving victories. Following Peter the Great's smashing triumph at the Battle of Gangut in 1714, the Great Northern War drags on for another 7 years, including several other smaller victories against Sweden at sea. But by the time Russia finally wins the war in 1721, Peter, his country, and his Navy are totally exhausted. Just 4 years later, in 1725, Peter dies at the age of 53. During his 36-year reign, his accomplishments are spectacular. His vision for a new Russia, a more modern and outward-looking Russia, is well on the way to becoming a reality. But he dies before many of his ambitions, including those for his Navy, are completely fulfilled. It will take decades of trials and failures, and another towering ruler, one also known as the Great, to vault the Russian Navy back to its former promise and glory. In all of Russian history, ships are never built faster than by the Soviet Navy in the early 1960s. Soviet Admiral Sergei Gorshkov is determined to build a force that can challenge the U.S. Navy for dominance of the world's oceans. And soon a Cold War naval arms race is fully underway. By 1965, the Soviet fleet possesses more than 3,000 vessels of all types, making it the largest in the world, ahead of even the U.S. Navy, which is number 2 with over 2,900 ships. However, there is one type of ship that isn't included in Gorshkov's naval expansion program, the aircraft carrier.
And at first they didn't have the technical expertise or indeed the building capacity to be able to do that. But they always had it in mind from the early 60s that they would at some stage have aircraft carriers.
Until he builds carriers, Gorshkov intends to even the odds with the U.S. Navy by concentrating on a new technical innovation, one that is a considerable gamble: the cruise missile.
Cruise missile is a small unmanned airplane. It carries a warhead. It can be guided somewhere. It can fly very low, hard to detect. And cruise missiles became a very interesting way of attacking ships. And the Russians particularly liked them and were the first to deploy them on a large scale.
Following World War II, the U.S. and other Western navies had experimented with these weapons, but quickly discarded them.
Was because of the predominance of American and other carrier battle groups that were able to deliver weapons at range against the likely targets at the time. The other reason is the West really had no peer competitor at sea for a long period during the 40s and 50s. The Soviets, on the other hand, realized that they couldn't compete platform for platform, vessel for vessel at sea. So they developed what essentially we call today a sea denial capability based around prototype guided missiles, which they derived from German models that they'd inherited.
Among the first and most important Soviet cruise missiles is the P-15 Termit, codenamed SSN-2 Styx by the West. Each of these 19-foot-long weapons weighs just over 5,000 pounds and has a range of around 25 miles. A liquid-fueled rocket engine drives it to just under the speed of sound. A radar seeker in the nose automatically identifies its target, which it then strikes, detonating its 1,000-pound high-explosive warhead. Originally, Soviet cruise missiles are intended purely as tactical weapons to be used mainly against enemy ships, not strategic weapons.
Strategic usually means you go after the heart of somebody's country. And in modern times, it's usually meant going after a city or something like that. Tactical means you go after his military. So, for example, a tactical missile would hit a ship. A strategic missile would, say, hit Moscow.
Gorshkov begins to extensively deploy the P-15 and other cruise missiles during the early 1960s, putting them on almost every type of vessel. But the leaders of Western navies aren't overly concerned.
Of course, at this time, nobody really knew how these weapons would perform in combat. There have been lots of trials. These things have flown through various profiles. They'd attack targets. But what about a functioning enemy?
Yet even as Gorshkov builds his massive surface fleet centered around these new weapons, he doesn't neglect the other undersea arm of the Soviet Navy. In fact, he is determined to have a submarine fleet that is second to none. A major reason for this is a huge advance in sub-design that has been made by the U.S. Navy, one that surprises Gorshkov and the Soviets in their own backyard. August 3, 1958. The world's first nuclear-powered submarine, the USS Nautilus, cruises under the North Pole. Nuclear power in submarines is a tremendous advance over earlier subs, which run on a combination of diesel and electric power.
A nuclear power unit allows the submarine not to have the need for additional supplies of fuel, and therefore it can remain underwater without surfacing for a long time.
In the U.S., the voyage of the Nautilus is heralded as a great scientific and technical achievement, but the Soviets view it very differently.
For the first time ever, a submarine was shown to be able to operate successfully under the ice, and of course the implication for this with regard to Russia was an intense shock, because it meant that a major attack platform could approach the Soviet mainland under the ice.
The Soviets countered by accelerating construction of their first group of nuclear-powered submarines.
The first version of the nuclear submarine was a torpedo nuclear submarine with a liquid hot water system, Project 627. I used to be in command of one such submarine in the Northern Fleet.
In the West, these subs are codenamed the November class. Like the Nautilus, the Novembers are attack submarines, meaning they are designed to attack surface ships and other submarines. The initial vessel of the November class is launched in August 1957, 3 years after the Nautilus. Because of its nuclear power plant, the November is able to stay submerged virtually indefinitely, just like the Nautilus. And on July 17, 1962, almost 4 years after the Nautilus's historic voyage, a November also journeys to the North Pole. But there are several design differences between the Soviet and U.S. nuclear subs.
Its main job would be to catch aircraft carriers before they could launch aircraft to drop nuclear weapons on the Soviet Union. So to do that, it had to be very fast.
Whereas the Nautilus is driven by a single nuclear reactor, the November class and most future Soviet nuclear subs have two. This helps give the Soviet sub a top underwater speed of 30 knots compared to the Nautilus's 23.5.
On the other hand, to make it fast, they had to live with a lot of noise. The reason noise matters is that a lot of submarines are detected by the noise they make. It made a lot of noise.
Although the November class has its problems, its speed and performance still impress the U.S. Navy, helping to pave the way for the development of newer and faster U.S. submarine types.
And we can see throughout the Cold War this competitive leapfrogging going on between the world's two military superpowers.
In the meantime, both the U.S. and Soviet navies are developing an entirely new role for the submarine, one that will make it the most powerful warship in the history of the world. On December 30th, 1959, the nuclear-powered USS George Washington is commissioned. By now, the US and Russia each possess several nuclear submarines, but the George Washington is different from any nuclear sub ever built. Within her hull, in an area her sailors dub Sherwood Forest because it looks like a grove of massive tree trunks, she carries 16 Polaris missiles. Each of these 28-foot-tall, 28,000-pound weapons carries a nuclear warhead and has a range of 1,200 miles. Unlike the cruise missiles pioneered by the Soviet Navy, they are ballistic missiles.
Cruise missiles can lock onto the target, can follow the target, and go hit it. A ballistic missile is very different. Fire it up, usually it gets out of the atmosphere, and then it comes down. And the coming down is all governed by the law of gravity, so it really can't be maneuvered very much on the way down. You have to fire it at something you aimed at when you fire the missile.
The George Washington and those like her that follow are part of a whole new type of submarine. They're nicknamed boomers.
This is because they fire missiles which go boom. It's as simple as that. But it's caught on in the sort of vocabulary of the Cold War.
Each George Washington carries enough nuclear force to obliterate over a dozen large cities. The U.S. has significantly upped the stakes in the Cold War naval arms race. Now, for the first time, the Russian homeland is vulnerable to nuclear annihilation from the sea. For Admiral Gorshkov and the Red Navy, it is an immense challenge, one that has to be met. The end result will be one of the largest and most devastatingly powerful submarines ever built. Rising out of the water like a small island, the Russian Typhoon-class ballistic missile submarine is by far the largest sub ever made. Weighing an estimated 34,000 tons submerged, it is nearly twice the displacement of the biggest U.S. sub, the Ohio class, which is 19,000 tons submerged.
In terms of building large submarines of gigantic water displacement, here we left America far behind by creating the Typhoon. It is a very large submarine, which was intended to use its weaponry from the Arctic regions. Break through very thick layers of ice with its own body.
Armed with 20 nuclear ballistic missiles, each with a range of over 6,000 miles, the Typhoon carries more destructive power than all the bombs dropped in all of World War II. Even those who serve aboard this giant are impressed by its size and capabilities.
I saw it for the first time in school. Compared to others, it is a gigantic ship. It also provides us with peace. And in case of war, we are ready to show our strength. Everybody knows his task and is always ready to perform it. It is, you can say, like a chained dog that gets fed in order to protect. And thus, there are no thieves. But in case of danger, the dog will bite.
The first Typhoon is launched in 1980, near the end of Admiral Gorshkov's tenure as commander of the Soviet Navy. It is the culmination of his building program for strategic nuclear missile submarines, or boomers, which began in 1954.
The typical ballistic submarine during the Cold War on the American side was the George Washington class. And this had to be countered by the Soviets, and they matched this with a class called the Yankee class, very appropriately. But even within the Soviet Navy, these were known as Ivan Washington class, or indeed Little Georges.
The initial Yankee-class sub goes to sea in 1967. Each carries 16 R-27 nuclear missiles with a range of around 1,500 miles. Eventually, 34 Yankees are launched, but both Gorshkov and the Western Allies continue to deploy even larger and more capable classes of boomers.
Towards the end of the Cold War, the transition from Polaris missiles to Trident was reflected in the fact that the Americans had the more sophisticated Ohio class and the British the new Vanguard class. Conversely, on the Soviet side, we saw the emergence of the new Delta class and its very advanced variant, the Delta IV. And this led in turn to be complemented by the huge Typhoon class.
Yet even as Admiral Gorshkov and the Soviets are developing their own family of boomers, they don't ignore other types of ships. In fact, under Gorshkov, the Soviets build large numbers of almost every kind of vessel, from air-cushioned hovercraft amphibious assault ships, to diesel-electric powered submarines, to nuclear-powered icebreakers, to small, swift patrol boats. Indeed, it is two of these fast patrol craft that win one of the least known, yet most significant naval engagements of the Cold War. October 21st, 1967. A pair of Soviet-designed Egyptian patrol boats sink a U.S. Navy surplus Israeli destroyer during one of the many Arab-Israeli wars. They accomplished this by firing a salvo of Soviet P-15 Termit cruise missiles. This is the first time cruise missiles have been successfully used in combat, and the U.S. and its allies take notice.
What you see after the incident is two different trends. One is serious attempts to protect Western ships against this threat. The threat was known before, there were some programs, but they're enormously accelerated. And the second, which really is new, is we want one also. And so you see the French create Exocet, which then is used in the Falklands very dramatically, and we create Harpoon.
In the meantime, the Soviets aren't standing still, deploying their own new family of advanced cruise missiles. Among the most capable is the P-700 Granite, codenamed SSN-19 Shipwreck by the West, which enters service in 1983. Each of these ramjet-powered weapons is 32 feet long, has a range of 340 miles, can reach speeds of nearly 2.5 times the speed of sound, and carries a 1,650-pound warhead. But most impressive, the Granite is designed to be fired in salvos of up to 24 missiles.
A typical launch profile would see one of the missiles climbing to 20,000 feet to provide guidance along the route to the target, while the others fly at lower level beneath it. Now, if this missile at 20,000 feet is shot down, because it's quite vulnerable at 20,000 feet, then another of the missiles will take its place and go to 20,000 feet and provide the guidance and the final targeting data for its chums along the way. So it's a very sophisticated weapon based not only on its own guidance system, but also targeting information from satellite and aircraft.
Gorshkov's strategy to employ his new generation of cruise missiles is complex and ambitious.
Gorshkov realized the United States Navy was working rather hard to beat down missiles coming in. But he knew that whatever measures we took, they had some limitations. So if there were enough missiles pouring in, especially from a lot of different directions, then there was a fair chance they would overwhelm the defense. So he bought himself not just a lot of missiles, but a lot of missile platforms. He had submarines, he had surface ships, he had aircraft. He demonstrates this kind of coordination in a big exercise called Okean, and it impresses us enormously.
With this new threat looming, U.S. naval leaders must develop a defense.
And it took two forms. In the first place, they developed much more sophisticated and powerful aircraft to take on the ships that were launching these missiles. And secondly, they produced integrated air defense systems.
This sophisticated, highly computerized system is called the Aegis Air Defense Radar System.
And you can see this in the development of the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and the Ticonderoga-class cruisers, which have very powerful phased array radars and missiles that can actually take attacking missiles out at extreme range and also at low levels. And typically, these integrated combat suites can take out a large number of missiles at once, thus countering the major advantage of Soviet systems that attack you from a large number of directions.
But to defeat these improved Western defenses, Gorshkov and the Soviet Navy have yet another card to play. Many of their cruise missiles are based under the sea. In 1972, a revolutionary Soviet nuclear-powered attack submarine takes to the seas, one that throws the leaders of the U.S. Navy into near panic. Why? Because it is so fast and can dive so deep that it can not only elude all existing U.S. subs, but even most of their torpedoes. This incredible vessel is the Alpha class.
Alpha was conceived as a very fast sub. The way they got their high speed was they took the most powerful reactor they could get, which was a fairly exotic liquid metal reactor. They wrapped the smallest, lightest hull around it, and they made the hull out of titanium so it would take up the least weight.
Lighter and stronger than steel, titanium is expensive and difficult to weld. But its use cuts the weight of the Alpha's hull by nearly 30%, while greatly increasing its strength, helping to give the sub an incredible top speed of nearly 45 knots. Following the launch of the November class in 1957, the Soviets rapidly developed several more types of nuclear attack submarines. Each one is faster and deadlier than the last. But they all have drawbacks as well. The main one being they are considerably noisier than their Western counterparts. This is a particular problem with the Alpha. Underwater, noise can be heard for hundreds of miles in some cases by somebody listening on a microphone or hydrophone of some sort. My colleagues told me that it was so noisy that when it came off the top of the North Cape, the top of Norway, doing 40 knots, it was heard all the way down in Bermuda. And it also had a very unstable reactor. But the positive spin-off was that the Americans in particular saw the need to have a new class of hunter-killer submarine that could counter this sort of technological package. And that was the Los Angeles class, which set the standard very much in the 80s for the sort of submarine that was required in the modern world. Then in 1985, the Soviets significantly evened the odds when they introduced the remarkable Akula class. When Akula was conceived, the Russians suddenly realized that we really could detect their submarines by their sounds, and therefore they made tremendous efforts to silence submarines. So they designed the Akula. It had to be countered, if only because the Americans wanted to stay on the forefront of technology. And we see new Western submarine designs now, the Seawolf and the Virginia class, which will be followed very rapidly soon by the Astute class in the United Kingdom, taking forward the boundaries of submarine design and noise quietening. Even though Western navies managed to stay ahead in the race for quiet submarines, there is one whole type of Soviet sub that the U.S. has no parallel to: a model specifically designed to fire cruise missiles.
America did not and does not have, due to the lack of need, submarines with cruise missiles intended for attacking large surface ships. The reason was in that we did not have such large surface ships as did the United States. I mean, aircraft carriers, which had to be destroyed in case of war with those kind of cruise missiles.
Like the cruise missiles they carry, there is a large variety of Soviet cruise missile submarines, both diesel-electric and nuclear-powered. But the early models all have one major problem. They can't fire their missiles while submerged. As a result, the Soviets continued developing newer, larger, and more capable cruise missile subs and weapons. In 1986, their efforts culminate in the awesome Oscar II.
One of the most potent Russian submarines is the Oscar II class, which is a major floating battery for SSN-19 shipwreck missiles. It deploys 24 of these, and it's capable of launching them from deep, undetected, with information received from satellite and other ships, submarines, and aircraft.
Weighing an enormous 24,000 tons and able to make submerged speeds in excess of 30 knots, the Oscar II class is one of the Russian Navy's most spectacular technical accomplishments, but it is also the focus of one of its worst tragedies. August 12, 2000. The Oscar II class submarine Kursk is on maneuvers in the Barents Sea.
Kursk was training with surface ships off of Murmansk to work up for a cruise to the Mediterranean. As part of these training exercises, the ships were firing weapons in simulated exercises.
Years before, in December 1991, the once mighty Soviet Union dissolved under the crushing burdens of a crumbling economy and intense political unrest. The Cold War ended, and the Soviet Navy once more became the Russian Navy. The confusion and shrinking budgets under a newly evolving government had a severe impact on this force.
После того, как распался Советский Союз,
Russia's economic capabilities prevented it from having a powerful fleet with such a great number of ships as it had earlier. The technology and weaponry got outdated, and the conclusion of the State Committee was that the tragedy was caused by a torpedo explosion inside the submarine.
Explosion detonates other torpedoes, and a highly pressurized wave of air and fire sweeps through the forward compartments of the Kursk. Most of the 118-man crew is killed as the Kursk sinks to the bottom in nearly 350 feet of water. But in the rear of the vessel, 23 survivors cling to life and hope. They know that a rescue operation at that depth is possible, and they believe it is coming. Though Russian naval authorities at the time realized that Western underwater rescue vehicles and equipment are superior to their own, they believe their rescue gear can handle the job.
But because of the weather and the technological limitations on the equipment that they had, meant that they left it far too late to call for help. I think there was also a measure of national pride in it as well, that they didn't want to contact their former enemies amongst NATO, the United States and the UK. And I suspect also there was a measure of wanting to keep the secrets associated with a platform like the Oscar secret. All these things, I think, conspired to make them delay.
Meanwhile, the few survivors aboard the Kursk wait and wait. In a hastily composed note, one of the men, 27-year-old Captain Lieutenant Dmitry R. Koleshnikov, writes of their ordeal. Though his exact words are not made public, some of his comments are reported.
All personnel from Section 6, 7, and 8 have moved to Section 9. There are 23 people here. We made this decision as a result of the accident. None of us can get to the surface. I am writing blindly.
They struggled on after Kursk sank, at first in light and then in utter darkness as the pressure built. And they finally died.
A monument to the 118 sailors who lose their lives aboard the Kursk is dedicated in the city of Zapyadnaya Litsa on the Barents Sea, where the submarine was based. But the principal Kursk memorial is in Serafimovsky Cemetery in St. Petersburg, the traditional home of Peter the Great's navy. Here, the Kursk's captain and 31 of his crewmen are buried. Ultimately, 94 bodies are recovered from the wreckage. The remainder are interred at cemeteries across Russia.
The loss of the Kursk was an immense tragedy for the Russian Navy. And not only for the Russian Navy, but for the whole nation and its people. And as a submariner, I completely understand the conditions of those who were on that submarine and their families. Was it possible to avoid this problem? You know, in any case, catastrophes existed, will exist, and continue to exist today. Some of the catastrophes are caused by people, and some of them occur independently. I think that the tragedy of the Kursk was neither a fault of its crew, nor of the Northern Fleet.
Yet just as the Cuban Missile Crisis served as a catalyst for advances and change in the Soviet Navy, so does the Kursk disaster for the new Russian Navy.
This accident opened eyes on many problems of our Navy. What can one say? When the whole country is in crisis, the Navy fleet cannot exist on an isolated oasis of welfare.
From the watery grave of the Kursk will arise a reformed and revitalized Navy, one that will build upon the traditions of the past, create new missions, and pose new challenges to the navies of the West. One of the vessels that embodies the continuing strength and modernized role of the new Russian Navy in the 21st century is the cruiser Peter the Great. Commissioned in 1998, she weighs 27,000 tons. With the one other operational ship in her class, they are the largest cruisers in the world. Some in the West dub them battle cruisers.
And they were designed by Admiral Gorshkov to project Soviet power and influence into the wider and developing world. If you look at the vessel, it is a formidable array of integrated missile systems, both in terms of attacking other surface ships out to 350 miles with the SSN-19 shipwreck missile, and a complicated array of anti-aircraft and anti-missile systems.
Those who serve aboard and command this vessel are extremely aware of the mission of their ship and the legacy of its name.
He was a father, a creator. It is his creation. Right next to us stands a cruiser that bears his name, Peter the Great, which is a powerful flagship of our Northern Fleet. His name on the ship reveals our attitude towards Peter and his achievements.
Among the roles this ship is designed to fulfill is to be part of an aircraft carrier task force. One of Admiral Gorshkov's last accomplishments was to approve a small number of true aircraft carriers, the first of which was launched in 1985.
I am commander of a group of ships, which includes the aircraft carrier on which you are standing and the nearby ships. This ship is armed with all the types of weapons which the naval fleet is assigned. I was lucky enough to serve more than 10 years on this ship, 3 years of which I had the honor to be in command. I served on other ships before, but this one left unforgettable impressions. It behaves wonderfully in the sea, and even during storms allows for the use of its weapons and the operations of the ship's aircraft. It's an enormous ship, a wonderful crew. It was perhaps the best time in my naval service.
Building carriers is a major step for the Soviet Navy, expensive and complex, and was only partially underway before Admiral Gorshkov retired in 1985. But in some ways, it is the crowning achievement of his tenure, a tenure that leaves an indelible impression on his Navy and its personnel.
Sergei Georgievich Gorshkov was a commander of the Navy fleet of the Soviet Union for over 30 years. In many foreign navies, including the American Navy fleet. We were envied that we had a commander-in-chief who was in power for such a long period of time. His contribution is priceless and prominent. When I was a lieutenant, I was lucky enough to meet him personally.
Gorshkov was a classic naval strategist. The purpose of naval strategy always, whoever's using it, is first to explain to people who live on land why the sea matters. He tried very hard to do that. He had some success. He was lucky to come in at a time when there was a lot of money for Russian defense, and he used it very cleverly.
The ultimate cost of continually building up the Navy and the collapse of the Soviet Union cut short the move to true aircraft carriers. But even though the Russian Navy today is a shadow of its former self, it is still an impressive force. In fact, these three ships, the cruisers Marshal Ustinov, Peter the Great, and the carrier Kuznetsov, are probably as powerful as any three surface vessels in the world, except for the nuclear aircraft carriers of the U.S. Navy.
The Russian Navy that you see now has the potential to grow back into the greatness of the past. It also has the potential to disappear.
To this day, people wonder what would have happened if ships like these had actually faced Western navies in non-nuclear combat.
I think it's fair to say that there would be a high level of attrition on both sides. But I think the simple fact of life is that the geostrategic realities of where the Russian Navy had to deploy from would have allowed NATO to overcome a fleet before it had properly deployed. If, on the other hand, the Russians had managed to get all their nuclear submarines into the Atlantic and they've been able to support them as Gorshkov originally intended, we may have had a problem.
Notwithstanding incidents like the devastating loss of the Kursk, the Russian Navy is still the focus of great national pride.
Despite the breakup of the Soviet Union, the rusting ships tied up at dock, the problems with morale, there is a future for the Russian Navy. And that future is in all of those young who attend the academies, and as they graduate in the very squares in front of the same buildings that their ancestors did for over 300 years.
Regardless of ongoing difficulties and restrictions, the members of this force, young and old, are united in their strong beliefs about their mission and the future of their Navy.
Russia remains a big naval empire which has expansive sea borders and certainly has its interests in the oceans. In order to provide for all these interests, a strong naval fleet is required.
The Russian vessels that ply the seas today are magnificent examples of naval engineering and design. The personnel who man and command them are tremendously honored by their accomplishments.
After all that's happened in my life, good or bad, I have always felt joy from the naval service. Studying and serving in the Navy fleet was not a burden, it was quite the opposite. I was always proud of my uniform.
These men and the vessels they serve on are the heirs of a seafaring tradition that's among the most venerable in the world. Through the single-minded genius and powerful will of a man known as Peter the Great, a people arose to establish their place among the family of nations. This ancient land has created and maintained a navy as powerful and innovative as any in history.